I took him upstairs. This is the third floor of an old apartment building, which, a very, to say the least, humble iconostas. He walks in and he looks around. He starts weeping and he says, I always knew something like this was possible.
The icon isn't overly detail oriented in the sense of being overly realistic, that there is a sort of obvious separation, but at the same time, it's portraying a historic humility.
If someone was to come into an Orthodox service, come into a temple, one of the first things that they're going to notice, God willing, beyond the people mulling around and seeing the people come in and venerating, we'll get to that, they'll notice the icons. Mm-hmm. And what they will notice in the icons, as opposed to, if we're talking in a kind of North American context, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe not, they've had experience with religious art. Maybe not, they'll definitely be exposed to a proliferation of images. Mm-hmm. Obviously,
right.
They're going to be taken aback by the expressions of the icon. And what I mean by the expressions of the icon, not just the expressions on the faces of the saints depicted, but the expression in regards of even how the icon is presented compositionally, the way that it comes across to modern Western eyes. It's going to be, for some people, it's unsettling. For some people, it's jarring.
Right.
If I could digress, I'd like to give a kind of
wherever you want to go.
There was a young man many years ago before our parish moved to where we're at now, and at this time, our community was linked to a nonprofit, and so we would offer emergency services to people, needing help with gas bills, light bills, whatever. And so oftentimes people in crisis, they're in crisis, and so people's lives are constituted in such a way that they're not always able to put their best foot forward, so you're meeting people really where they're at. Right. So this young man, he's with his child and the mother of the child, and he was in a bad state, and he was in a bad state for all kinds of reasons. Yes, there's drug use involved, but that drug use is a symptom of something deeper, right? So long story short, we start talking, and it's more along the lines of asking for help, and in between the chit chat, he started talking about some things here and there. And I don't remember now at this point in time, but he brought up something like the Nephilim or something that. He had been watching YouTube, whatever.
Yep,
so
diving down the rabbit holes.
It pricked my ears up. I'm like, oh, blah blah blah, and he's like, oh, you know what that is? I'm like, well, I just kind of like showed him my robe. I'm like, well, yeah. Welcome to St. Mary's, whatever. So, anyways, long story short, we start talking, and he's intrigued, and so at that time, the parish was on the third floor of this kind of like old department store building, which had become the parish and then then the nonprofit. So I took him upstairs, and on the third floor, we come up the elevator, blah, blah, blah. And we walk in, and now take in mind, let me paint this picture for you. This is the third floor of an old department building, which, thanks be to God, it wasn't condemned. So in like really bad shape, but we made do with what we had. And a very, to say the least, humble iconostas. And the walls were, lined with, sometimes printed off icons, just every, you know what I mean? Very humble, right? He walks in and he looks around, and this is a guy who, most people, maybe even most viewers, if they saw him in the street, they may think, might think twice talking to him, right? If you follow what I'm saying. He starts weeping. Not like a tear, he starts weeping. And he's looking around, and he says, I always knew something like this was possible.
Wow.
And we just start talking, Real long story short, eventually he gets baptized, and this whole thing happens. But the icon, And what the icon expressed to him was this profound humility. And in that humility, the context of it, yes, the surroundings of the temple and how, for some people, they would even say this isn't even a proper Orthodox church, whatever. But it was the icon. It wasn't the quote unquote shabbiness of the building. It was the icon. And again, forgive me for zooming in too much.
No.
Also take in mind, humble iconostats. We're not talking 4 foot high icons. We're talking like you'd have to kind of get up there, but it's enough to see, like, that's what I meant by the expression of the icon being humble, not just the expression on the face of those depicted in the icon, but the icon itself.
Right.
We oftentimes underestimate what's really happening in the phenomena of the icon and what's being transmitted to us, especially us as modern Western people, is a profound sense of humility that is absolutely absent from our experience, culturally, generationally. And when people encounter it, when people are themselves in a really humble state, it resonates with them on a level that is deep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Let's continue that. So this iconography, the artistic style of the icon, you could probably describe as humble. It's not. And we briefly touched on this in the last one on occultism. The icon isn't overly detailed oriented in the sense of being overly realistic. That there is a sort of obvious separation, but at the same time, it's portraying a historic humility. The icons are historic. They're actually depicting historical events. They're depicting things within space and time, yet the way we portray it is in a humble way. The event itself is almost always depicting something dealing with humility.
Yes. So again, this in of itself is so far removed from people's experience, even just like religious art in general. Because you take in mind too, and I don't want this to be taken in an uncharitable light. But we're just comparing and we're contrasting. But if you look at, even from my experience with like what would be considered conventionally speaking, quote unquote, Western, religious art.
Sure.
What enraptures people oftentimes is the absolute beauty,
right,
in regards of, the artistic skill that's put into place. Think of the Sistine Chapel.
The marble statues.
No one is going to say that that's humble.
Right.
You're right. It overwhelms you.
Right.
Because of the natural beauty that's being put forth. Right. And so the theology behind that is different. I mean, you see that in the architecture in the West, in regards of, spires and steeples moving upwards, jutting up, penetrating into the heavens, right? Whereas with the traditional Byzantine architecture, which, in North America, we make do with what we have, right? But when people when money isn't an object or an issue, what do people do? They build domes, right? And the dome is this, it's the square and the circle, heaven being the dome, the square being earth, but the dome coming down and meeting, right? Earth, right? There is this unity that happens, and there's if I could use this term, there's a mutual humility on both in this joining together. Whereas in a kind of conventional sense for the West, it's this jutting up, this penetration, which, if you're adept enough theologically, you can kind of like make anything work. But I think when you kind of move past any type of attempt at sophistry and seeing how it affects the people, what's revealed again is there is a profound humility that we encounter when we enter into the life of the saints in heaven, primarily through the iconographic experience, right? It speaks to us, and so much more so now than ever before, because our minds are inundated with anything but humility. Our minds, the oversaturated colors of the screen, the oversaturated colors of everything from the comic book to the magazine, if people read them, right? There's a palette that someone almost has to begin to like cultivate when they become Orthodox, right? Because the icon presents a fast. It presents a
Oh,
fast to the
interesting. Yeah.
eyes and to the senses in a way that we are so used to the fast food of images, again, saturation of color,
Mm-hmm.
even in regards of compositions being designed in such a way to be almost, if I could use this term, instantly addictive.
Right.
This is why some people, I'll give you a little tip, if you're having problems with your phone, certain phones, you can set them to black and white. You can desaturate the screen. If you do that, actually that will help mitigate some of your addictive responses with the use of the phone. That's a
Wow.
whole yeah,
I never thought
that's a
about
whole
that.
yeah, that's a whole
Yeah,
thing.
that's a
And
great point.
for any of my brothers, for any young men out there, if you're struggling with some, addiction with images, if you were to do that on your phone right there, coupled with prayer and some other things and spiritual guidance, you'd see some real progress and cutting away from those behaviors. But anyways,
Yeah.
I digress. Forgive me. Um, the icon does this even now, because even when you have contemporary iconographers, which I am one, right? Like our tendency, we almost can't help it. There's a certain pop that we employ, but even when it's like, what I mean by pop, right? In a aesthetic sense, it's like you would take a strong contrast between a dark and a bright color, right? And you juxtapose them, and the bright will pop, right? That we
Oh,
call it a
okay.
pop,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that prayerfully can be used to bring a person into the icon, but even then it's subdued in compared to how we experience art and religious art in the West, right?
Right.
Because it's not trying to inundate and overwhelm your senses with a naturalistic beauty,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
There's a humility that's baked into it, if I
Right.
could use that
Even the
term.
sort of two-dimensional character of it, we don't use three-dimensional. We aren't using statues. It's
Right.
not overly realistic. And as you're speaking, one of the things that came to mind is the humility of the icon being able to transcend literacy itself. Right.
Yes.
So there's even a sort of humility in the absence of iconography, maybe Protestantism, at the absence of visual cues. The theology becomes very head oriented because we have to read it, we have to rationalize it, we have to think about it. And this, as Orthodox, we understand the entire church, the entire theology as a mystery. It's mystical. And the icons, in a way, is this very humble presentation that transcends, it bypasses so many of these registers of information, of how we process information, and can really speak to the literate or the non-literate person equally effectively.
Well, if I could, I would say not only can it does.
Right,
And,
right.
and this is why, speaking of theology and theology of humility, like as we would all say, right? Like, and this is a common thing for us contemporary Orthodox, we'd say like a theologian isn't one who studies, but one who prays,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And so oftentimes one of the dangers of understanding theology in an exclusively academic or scholastic context is it puts a person in a vulnerable position spiritually,
Mm.
in which what they think they're apprehending is exactly that. It's a problem. They're apprehending a what versus a who,
Oh, yes.
right? A what versus a who. The icon, in some ways, can help circumvent that, and in an almost imperceptible way, it presents you with this reality that you're encountering a who, not a what.
Right.
And that encounter of the person it necessitates a fundamental humility,